Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com. Lately, we've been having a lot of discussion about mediocrity and what it means in the world of music and criticism and other things. And I really think it's a topic worth expounding on just a little bit, the perils and pitfalls of the mediocre. One of you pointed out in a very, very smart bit of commentary that mediocrity, calling something mediocre, can actually be far more devastating than just calling it bad or just plain bad. I think the remark went something along the lines of, well, there are things that are like fabulous and wonderful, and then there are things that are just horrible, and because they're horrible, they're actually fun, and we enjoy them. But the mediocre middle, there's something about that that's really problematic for many because it's utterly dismissive. It's totally lacking in distinction. And what we want in a great performance, of course, is distinction, that which makes it stand out from the crowd. But to say that it's mediocre is really tantamount to saying that it's anonymous. And that's just about the most awful thing you could say about a performance of a piece of classical music, particularly when everyone is playing the same stuff, right? I mean, if you've got 7 million versions of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, then one that doesn't stand out in any particular way, it might as well not exist. It has no right to exist. And so calling it mediocre brings up all of those issues. It has all of those connotations of anonymity, pointlessness, worthlessness. It's really kind of a great term for that reason, as a tool of criticism. When I started doing this little series of mediocre Mahler performances, which will continue, by the way, at least a few of them, we'll see where they go. Some of you said, "Oh, keep on being politically correct, keep on being extreme." Well, in my world, as you correctly pointed out, being mediocre is an invitation to extremity. And one of the things that's always happened, and it's fascinating to me, is that the biggest blowback I've gotten as a critic has not come from bad reviews. It hasn't. For some reason, the answer to a bad review, well, there are several answers to a bad review that people can give. One is the critic's a loon. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's a jerk. You could curse. You can hurl back similar invective and feel perfectly justified. That's number one. Number two is that you can always answer, well, it's not as bad as he says, because the language is so hyperbolic that the hyperbolist must clearly be exaggerating, and therefore it's really not as terrible as he says he is. But of course, the answer to that is, okay, it isn't. It's just mediocre, in which case you're even worse than where you started out with the bad review, as often as not. But that's a legitimate response, and I've seen that tons of times to my videos and other reviews. People come in and say, well, I listened to it, and it's not all that terrible. To which my response is, who cares? It's not great. That's the point, because we don't want anything but the best. That's what we're trying to do. So mediocrity is a loaded term. And I want to give you an example of what happened when mediocrity, or just averageness, or just a small criticism in the context of the whole happened. Now, many of you know that I have, screamed for years and years and years about the period instrument movement's refusal to acknowledge vibrato in orchestral recordings. Now, this is changing. And frankly, one of the reasons it's changing, I think, is because of the work of me and other people who have finally called out these jokers for the scholarly frauds that they are. Oops, that's not a mediocre term. The lack of what's the word? A lack of diligence in their scholarship. They're mediocre, and they really are. But we'll get to that. I wrote a review. I want to tell you how this whole thing happened. It came about because it really does bear on the issue of mediocrity. Slight, meaning slight criticism. You don't have to use the word mediocre, but here we are. I wrote a review in 2009 of Ronald Brautigam doing Beethoven piano concertos on Bis, and the conductor was Andrew Parrott. And here is the review. I want to read the review so you get a sense of just the whole thing. You ready? Here we go. Ronald Brautigam is an excellent Beethoven pianist, and he turns in a performance of the second concerto solo part that's as lively and attractive as anyone has yet recorded on a modern instrument. It's especially nice to hear the finale taken at a tempo that permits all of the main theme's rhythmic bounce to register without it ever sounding breathless or frantic. The same holds true of the rondo in B-flat, the second concerto's original finale. Indeed, the only caveat in these performances concerns the slow movements, where Andrew Parrott, evidently with the acquiescence of his soloist, encourages the orchestra to indulge in that dry, vibrato-less string tone that is the very opposite of stylishness and utterly contrary to what their own sources say about sustained lyrical music in slow tempos. The E-flat concerto is an early work in Mozartian style, here very nicely reconstructed by Brautigam from the existing piano score. Indications of scoring in the keyboard part point to an orchestra of strings, 2 flutes, and 2 horns, a very unusual combination, and I'm not convinced that 2 oboes ought not to have been added as a matter of course. Still, there's no denying the distinctive tone color that the absence of double reeds gives the work's overall sonority, and it would be hard to imagine a more sympathetic performance than this one, never mind Parrott and his scratchy strings. I look forward to further releases in this, so far, very rewarding edition. Okay, that's the review. That was the whole review. It got a 9.9. I mean, it was almost entirely positive with one caveat, which I dismiss at the end of the review. So that was the only element of what maybe you would call mediocrity, less than greatness. The average for the period instrument movement, what they were doing there and what Parrott was doing. So I got the most vicious email from Andrew Parrott after that review got published, a very arrogant and snippy screed talking about who the hell are you and you don't know what you're talking about and, I've studied this and I know what I'm doing and, blappity, blappity, blab, like that. And that annoyed me considerably because, of course, I had done my homework and my research, and I did know that I was right and he was wrong. And after that, I proceeded to write and write and write. At the end, there were 600 pages of essays and evidence on the Classics Today website, which I took down a while ago. They're still out there in cyberspace, I think. But, I used all of the evidence that I'd gotten in a series of scholarly papers, which were since published in peer-reviewed journals on vibrato and the classical orchestra, the romantic orchestra. You know about that stuff because I've talked about it before. And what the evidence is. And there is tons and tons of positive evidence and virtually no negative evidence for what I'm talking about. So, that's the bottom line. But it was because of that positive review with a couple of hints of what might have been mediocre about the performance that this whole thing got started. And the anger and vituperation as a result of any criticism, because that's what it comes down to, doesn't it? It's not just that something is mediocre, it's that you're criticizing it for not being great. And depending on how thin-skinned the artists or the other people involved are, you may get hysteria at anything less than just an exalted review. And so many artists today, particularly, still adhere to that horrible Wagnerian artist hero nonsense. I see it in the comments here too, that you should not criticize these people because, they're such geniuses. They work so hard. They're magnificent. They're wonderful. We should be worshiping the ground they walk on. Well, bullshit. We shouldn't. They're entertainers. And if we're not entertained, we should call them out for it. That's the truth. That's the reality. And they are neither more nor less than that. However much you respect them, they are offering a product to the public, and that product has to be compared to all the other products that are being offered to the public to see which ones are the best ones and what their pluses and minuses are. And there's nothing wrong with making that evaluation. But the term mediocre, the other really major encounter with mediocrity that caused the hysteria that I remember recently is when ClassicsToday.com reviewed, and I mentioned this before too, a solo piano disc played by George Walker, the African-American composer. It was Schumann, I think, for the most part. And our fantastic piano guy, Jed Disler, wrote a very, very fair, incredibly well-balanced, detailed review suggesting that while it was good, George Walker was no Vladimir Horowitz. He was making comparisons. And then we started getting hate mail about the fact that we were racist and threats and craziness, all coming from George Walker or his minions. Some of them were unsigned, you know. But it was absolutely insane. Insane, because it was a very nice, sympathetic, kind. I mean, Jed is not really like me. I mean, he's much more balanced in terms of his personality than I am, although he can go there too when circumstances warrant. But the recording got like a 7 out of 10. It wasn't bad. It just wasn't great. Some people just can't handle the "you're just not great" remark, that adjudication of their relative ability compared to everything else that's out there, the things that are great. And it's just an amazing phenomenon. So I just want to comfort those of you who feel that because we're doing a series called a mild-mannered survey of the mediocre, that it's not going to have just as much pizzazz or weight or point as the most hysterical, screaming, ranting lunacy that I sometimes indulge in talking about recordings that I truly detest. Because it really doesn't matter, does it? If it isn't the best, it's irrelevant. That's the bottom line. And that's what the term mediocre is really saying. And there is nothing that artists particularly object to than being termed irrelevant. And I don't blame them. I don't blame them at all. They don't work their asses off and starve and suffer to be irrelevant. I mean, to say that you don't matter, I mean, it may be the cruelest cut of all. It very well could be. I'm not complaining about the reaction. I'm just saying, let's be clear. Let's be clear about what it means. Because as another of you pointed out, or maybe the same person in the comment, mediocre may mean middling. But in the world of the arts, middling is apocalyptic. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. Take care.